All right. So maybe just give a little bit of background on climate change impacts and actions. A bit blunt, but sorry. So as we know, climate change will affect people differently according to their cultural, economic, and environmental and social context. We also know that social differentiation is a crucial determinant of vulnerability. And the capacity to adapt in response to change is shaped by power relations, determining access to resources, information, and the availability of options and choices. And I think very important here is the emphasis on power relations. And climate action, actually, what we have realized, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, can actually reinforce existing inequalities and power imbalances. This could happen by that climate action are not accessible to the most vulnerable and those in need. But we have also seen something else, and there has been a much more concern that women are differently impacted by climate change than sometimes men. And there has been happening a lot of gender mainstreaming in policy and projects. So we see a lot of gender-related requirements by funders and policymakers, gender markers, frameworks, and things like that. But there's often there's still a binary thinking, women versus men. And what is not really considered how it relates to ethnicity, religion, and class. So there's a danger there that instead of really looking at what are the causes of these vulnerabilities and marginalization, that if we're narrowly looking at gender, we might not be able to really address these inequalities and vulnerabilities. And so when looking now into the climate change scholarship and gender, what we can say is the scholarship really has brought into attention to the gendered barriers and limits to adaptation and mitigation. It has pointed out the patriarchal norms hamper women's access to resources, education, and decision-making for adaptation and mitigation, especially in relation to control over land and technologies. And it also has highlighted the feminization of responsibility. And a good example is, for example, that rural women that take on extra farm work in addition to their already extensive responsibilities as smallholders, family carers, and managers of households in order to cope with and adjust to a changing climate. So it relates to the extra burden that is put on women. But the climate change scholarship also has fallen short in many ways. There are still dominant discourses ignore the underlying mechanisms that exacerbate gender inequalities within wider social relations of production and reproduction. We still see a lot of misleading narratives in the climate change literature. And one of these is that women are helpless and incapable of acting and making decision in response to climate-related stresses. So there's very little agency given to this woman, or women are seen as a strong agent. They are the protector of the environment. They will solve this climate crisis, this as a solution, but also completely out of context what the woman's experience really is. Then we also see a lot of simplistic dichotomies, understanding gender as a binary and positioning women as a homogeneous group. Often we see that in mitigation studies. Women's identity are projected as fixed, centered, and uniform, and other factors such as age, wealth, class, and ethnic affiliation remain ignored. And analysis often ignores that women and men alike constantly negotiate adaptation and power while deliberating trade-offs to protect themselves and their families. So again, it's a relation aspect we need to pay close attention to. So as a consequence, in many ways, power operates to maintain and entrench intersectional inequalities remains often poorly understood in the climate change scholarship. And that's why I think it is important to turn back to intersectionality, because intersectionality aims to dismantle the false binaries pervasive in the gender and climate change literature by widening the analytical lens to investigate the multidimensional nature of inequalities. It highlights how interconnected aspects of social difference, including gender, race, caste, class, constitutively shape individual experience in complex and shifting ways. The underlying assumption for intersectionality is that social categories are constructed and dynamic. And the focus here really is on identifying and analyzing power and to unveil explicit and implicit assumption about social categories and their relations. It is also a recognition of the complex horizontal when we talk about intercommunity relations and vertical from national, regional to local interactions. An intersectional lens reveals the situational nature of multidimensional inequality. A broader focus does not discount the crucial relevance of gender in adaptation and mitigation, but it avoids a binary way of thinking about gender. And one important aspect that is really stressed in intersectionality scholarship is the importance of context-driven approaches. And yesterday we heard a lot how important it is to get context-specific knowledge on the different cases that we had looked at. And this helps to avoid the essentializing group and individual experience by paying close attention to economic, political, and social aspects that shape pervasive inequalities. So the important insights actually from intersectionality is that gender is never a standalone marker for inequality. We really need to start understanding the entangled and relational nature of power and exclusionary practices. And we need methodological innovations, especially bringing in the transdisciplinary scholarship, working with communities, allowing them their voices, their visions to be heard and integrated, and focusing on place-based, but also cost-level and cost-scale investigations. And this is also a call for the politicalization of climate-related problems. I think we are beyond just being researchers, but I think we have to start dealing with the politics if you really want to address inequalities. And based on that, what we did as Britta mentioned, I'm part of the Tsitsika project, and in our project, we were interested in gender, but we also took a wider approach by looking at the 3 dimensions of inequality, equity, procedural equity, distributive equity, and recognitional equity. And in the work that we did under the Tsitsika projects, we really wanted to assess from a practitioner perspective whether and how selected climate change intervention have decreased climate risk while simultaneously reduce poverty, inequality, and promote equity at the local level. And so what we did, we interviewed selected implementers, evaluators, and funders of climate change projects from Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. In total, we had 56 interviews, and you can see the distribution across the countries. And we wanted to assess the extent to which the project have promoted the 3 dimensions of social equity, recognitional, procedural, and distributional. But we also wanted to unpack the context and processes that can result in positive and negative outcome of the different social groups. And this wider lens really helped us to understand more the contextual factors that lead to marginalization of certain groups. And just to explain a little bit the frameworks that we used, So distribution equity refers to how resources, costs, and benefits are allocated or shaped amongst people and groups. And then recognition equity refers to acknowledgement of the respect for identity, values, and associated rights. Procedural equity highlights how decisions are made and the extent to which different people and groups are able to influence these and have their perspective represented and incorporated. So while recognition and procedural equity are overlapping, the former is concerned more with political participation and the latter with social recognition. And they all interact. And so how did we apply it? So we looked at these projects and asked the implementer evaluators of funders how they paid attention to existing rights, how they integrated indigenous local knowledge, how they used language, whether that was very technical language, whether they used the local language, how they paid specific attention to rights of more marginalized groups. And then from a procedural perspective, did the project communicate, consult often and widely? Did it try to elicit a wide range of voices for project planning, design, and implementation? And who actually participated in these different phases? Did it provide training to participate and mediate? Were they able and had a mechanism in place to mediate power imbalances? And for the distributional, we really asked them who actually benefited, who was disadvantaged by these activities and why. And within here, we also thought more about how did it impact on women. And so there were some key insights with regard to gender equity. And one of the most important was that we can see there's tensions between the three dimensions of equities, in particular, the navigating between the recognitional equity versus procedural. As I said, there are a lot of these days, a lot of gender markers, a lot of policies by funders to include gender. But if it's not context sensitive, it can create a lot of conflict with existing traditional values, and so this requires a fine balance. And we really realized that these intermediary organizations that often implement climate action, like climate mitigation and adaptation projects, play a critical role in navigating these tensions. And what was very important was to recognize some of the traditional roles and of women and what women can do or cannot do, and what are their inspirations, rather than coming in and saying, we just need to empower you. Another important aspect was also how critical awareness raising and sensitization was of the community, not just of the woman, because that really led to support by men in the traditional authorities. And we found that most successful are those projects that find innovative ways of breaking power constellations. And that is through avoiding the alienation of the so-called power holders by creating new relationships. So we had a lot of projects where young women were put into contact with the traditional authority by the women bringing in new knowledge, because the way they have learned from science about climate change and other aspects. So it's just really trying to shift slowly these relationships. And what we also find is that gender is considered for many projects due to funder requirements, also awareness of differential vulnerability, but many approach gender in a binary way still. There's very little attention to age, socioeconomic status, or religion. We also found that small context-sensitive consideration can make a big difference. Just the timing of meetings, whether there's childcare, to incorporate women into better decision-making. So that's just a few insights from our Tsitsika project. And I think I stop here, and I would like to invite our next speaker to please come, Julia. So Julia is a researcher from the Climate and Inequality Center at the University of Wits. Is that correct? sorry, yeah. So, and previously she has worked with the Congress of the South African Trade Union, COSATU, on their just transition. That would be really nice.
Good morning. Thanks very much. Very interesting presentation and a great start to the session. I know it's like right in front of my face, but I have to look at it. Stand on the side. Okay. Is that better? Okay. Great. So I'm going to be talking about some research I've done in the Northern Cape. And the main kind of reason for this research is that we keep talking, and I mean, today and yesterday, I'm sure it'll happen again. Well, today I'm sure it'll happen again, but it came up yesterday a lot, this idea of a just transition and like a just energy transition in particular as something in the future. And actually, over the last 10 years, South Africa has been building renewable energy power stations. And so there's a transition that's already underway. And the question is that just? And what is the experience on the ground of those processes so far? So there's also this idea of the just energy transition, which is, so hopefully going to be a solution to poverty, unemployment, and inequality while shifting the economy to a low carbon, a lower carbon model. But there is no real reason that low carbon sources of energy are more equitable or egalitarian. That's, it's a bit of an assumption. They can be just as exploitative. So my question really is, what is the experience of people who are in these towns in the Northern Cape where renewable energy has already been developed? And what does that mean for people who are feeling very uncertain and fearful of a transition? For example, those in the coal sector who feel that they're going to lose their livelihoods, even though there are promises of net gains in models. Where are those jobs, net gains in jobs in the modeling? Kind of where are those jobs? What kinds of skills are required? Whether it will really improve livelihoods or not, and how it's going to impact gendered labor is a key question. I don't know where I'm supposed to click this thing. So my approach was a feminist political economy approach. And this means that I didn't want to just focus on the formal sector jobs, because I think that ignores a significant part of the economy, which is unpaid care work and other types of work conducted in the household, which are required to reproduce and maintain labor power, and have often been socially constructed to be women's work, which is naturalized and undervalued. So as kind of Nadine said this morning, often women are seen as either the saviors or the victims of climate change, but it's much more complex than that. And this approach looks at the concept of social reproduction, which is kind of less acknowledged in broader political economy, but extremely important for the survival of any society. So it's the work that's done when you get home from work and you eat supper and have to sleep and have to, look after your health. And who does all of that work? It's often women in the household. So under this idea of social reproduction, there are three institutions that are linked and co-constituted, but central to understanding how we reproduce labor. And that's the economy, the household, and the state. Oh. Okay. This is just another quote on social reproduction. It's talking about the production-reproduction systems that are intertwined, and how the economy is often related to productive consumption, generating employment and wages. the family or household is seen as the main institution for self-managed reproduction, and then the state is the locus of collective consumption, programs, and policies. So in my research, I also wanted to understand this idea of the just energy transition and what a gender-just energy transition might look like. So based on some of the literature and also the experience on the ground, the issues central to justice are livelihoods, energy poverty, income inequality, job quality and conditions, gender inequality, human rights, and access to basic services. And I think often we just think about jobs, when actually there are all of these different complex issues that need to be addressed for a truly just energy transition. And I want to highlight that energy access is really required for the social provisioning to allow for well-being. So for healthcare, for cooking, for cleaning, it's all made much easier by the provision of electricity and other basic services like water, and even access to land. And the feminist political economy perspective illustrates how energy access in the household is an important struggle for the unpaid workers involved in social reproduction, whose needs and conditions of work should be as important as paid labor in the conceptualization of the just energy transition. So these are the three towns that I focused my research on. They're all in the Northern Cape. They are Kuruman, Kathu, and Uppington. And I selected these three towns because they were surrounded by 2 or more solar power plants that have been built over the last 10 years within South Africa's renewable energy power procurement program, which is run by Eskom, where private producers of power then sell to Eskom as the main buyer. So here's another image just showing the location of the independent power producer projects around those towns. This is a picture of one of the concentrated solar power plants in Uppington. So the key findings are, in terms of gendered occupations in solar power, based on the interviews, it seems that only around 24% of the workforce on solar power plants were women. Interestingly, there seem to be higher numbers of women in managerial roles, which contradicts the common experience of women in lower wage and lower skill work. But some people argued that maybe because it's a new industry, younger people are involved in renewable energy, and they're less constrained potentially by gender roles. But there is still occupational segregation within the workplace. So women worked in the office or as cleaners during construction, and men were kind of in the construction and, welding and installing the solar panels often. There was also an experience of sexism and racism at work. So my interviews included, sorry, I forgot to mention in the past slide, that I interviewed workers who'd been working on the solar power plants, community members who were living nearby to those solar power plants, and managers of the solar power plants, and lastly, government officials involved in the IPP projects. So the experiences in the workplace were of, it wasn't a particularly equitable or just workplace. It has the usual issues, particularly with subcontracting, as is the standard in South Africa. There's also, in the households, in these communities, there's definitely, a woman as homemaker and man as breadwinner division of labor in the household. This was expressed by people saying that their responsibilities in the household, as the women who I interviewed said that their responsibilities were around children, cooking and cleaning, whereas many men said that they had the financial responsibility. But that isn't to say that those are the only kind of roles that people took on. There were households where a man was doing all of the cooking and cleaning and looking after his elderly grandfather, which is why I think it's so important that we can't say, we're actually looking at the broader issue of unpaid care work in the household and how that is carried out, whether it's done by a woman or a man or a Black woman or, whether it's by race or gender is less important. But this fact that this unpaid care work is largely done by Black women in South Africa particularly is an issue. There's also, so in households around these communities, there's various strategies that are adopted to survive, because so Kuruman and Katu are old mining towns, and Uppington is an agricultural town. So there's some family members who are involved in mining, some people who are involved in seasonal agricultural work, but many people are reliant on income from social grants, or they have a little patch of land where they're growing some food. They might have a few cattle. So there's various strategies that are adopted, but you could largely say that there's a crisis of social reproduction in these towns, that people are struggling to make ends meet day to day because of these issues of a lack of kind of decent work, a living wage, access to land, access to water, access to electricity. And so even the market opportunities created by the solar power plants were short-term. I spoke to many workers from the solar power plants who were involved in the construction, and the job was good while it lasted, but it was over after they varied between 6 to 18 months contracts, and so the ongoing livelihoods weren't really affected by these short-term contracts. And so there's an argument that opportunities created by the solar power plants are exploitative because of the racism, sexism, issues in the workplace and conditions of work, and short-term, and households continue to seek out alternative sources of income for survival. When I question kind of what is the perspective of the community of the impact of the solar power plants, they kind of said, well, what's the use of this? It hasn't improved our access to electricity. We haven't gotten long-term jobs. Who's benefiting actually? And so this picture shows a solar power plant that is located right next door to a manganese mine. And the way that the South African grid is set up is largely around the minerals energy complex. So mines have determined where our grid goes. And that has meant that our renewable energy plants have to plug into the existing grid. And that often means they're plugging in right next to a mine. And in this instance, community members said that they've thought that the solar power plants were benefiting the mine because during load shedding, the mine is plugged into the same substation and can access the power when the rest of the community doesn't have power. And I asked the manager of this power plant, and he said he's not sure, but that might be the case. As the solar power plants have not improved energy access or affordability for local communities, they question who's really benefiting from their construction. So in conclusion, my findings show that there is an energy transition happening at the moment, but if it continues to happen in the current format, it's not just. It's not going to be just. Because in the economy, short-term work opportunities and exploitation of workers increases this crisis of social reproduction, where we don't have enough access to care, health, etc. In the households, solar power plants have not improved access to electricity or other important resources for subsistence, such as land and water, which people are relying on for their livelihoods. And if we use this case study of what a larger scale energy transition could look like, there's indeed cause for concern, as the energy transition in its current form promises promises further exploitation and exacerbation of the crisis of social reproduction, not justice at all. Thanks very much.
So this was really insightful and really showed some of the structural challenges.
yeah, the unpaid care work, the lack of decent work, and the basic government services that are non-existing and that are still remaining. Can I ask Jacqueline to please come forward? Hi, Jacqueline. So Jacqueline is a PhD student at the University of Nairobi in the Department of Political Science. And she will present today on policy intervention for inclusive climate governance regimes, reducing gender basic inequalities. So welcome.
Thank you very much. And as we say, as we wait for the setup, I'd request all of us to clap for the ladies in the room because today it's 8th of March, it's International Women's Day. Clap for all of them. So I'm gonna be talking today on the policy interventions for climate change. But before I dive into that, I'd like us to just pay attention to the photo on the screens. And that's Lake Naivasha. In this area, there used to be flower farms. However, the water from the lake has invaded and it's no longer a farm. And what you see, the green there, it's hyacinth. It's a crisis for all our waters. And this picture reflects what Kenya is going through because now the man who is a tourist is stuck. They can't move. And our Kenyan economy rely on tourism, on agriculture, and that's just what the policies are saying. And the intervention I'm looking at are mainly focusing on how gender responsive are the policies. I don't know whether this is moving anymore. So my presentation has 2 sections, and I'll focus on disseminating the policy intervention. And on the second section, I'll have a look at the overview of the breaches of the policies. So to begin with, these are the policies that I looked at that the Kenya government has put in place to alleviate climate change impact and promote inclusive environmental sustainability. Of highlight is Climate Change Act. We have the National Adaptation Plan along these ones also. And the focus of the government now is climate smart agriculture, as we're going to see in the literature review. So the government has a key interest on influencing gender responsive climate implementation and reforms with specific focus on inclusive climate actions. So Kenya promotes sustainable futures with increased conservation in rural and urban communities. One of the targets is inclusive governance. So when I say climate smart agriculture, it's the government target is to facilitate adequate food security. So where are the gaps? That's the question I was asking in my research. So as Nadine has mentioned, and all the speakers that were there yesterday, some of them mentioned, including Monica and others, that women and men are both key actors. A group of the current provinces do not provide regulations, and they don't include empowerment for young women in climate change adaptation. And I've put it in red because it requires our attention, that the policy gaps I've mentioned have led to increased gender-based inequalities, and that exclusion of women has made attainment of equality, both procedural, distributive, whichever equality you talk about, it is impossible. So if we have to attain climate change mitigations and adaptation, then we have to address these policy gaps that I'm talking about. So I'll not focus more on the climate smart agriculture, but just in the middle, there is a mention of the climate agriculture strategy 2017-2016, which is still in effect up to date. And that was on the intervention that were there were focused on raising the standards, increasing productivity, for example, facilitating farmers with fertilizer, which is our current president is known for, to increase production per every acre. But it doesn't talk about who is providing the labor. Again, providing farmers with maize that can adapt to the long and short-term stresses such as low rainfall, especially now that we are experiencing drought, and high levels of rainfall that are coming that will lead to floods. So those are the highlights. So the meat of my presentation lies here. Yes, the Constitution provides a Bill of Rights where we have the right to clean and healthy environments. And Vision 2030, which is an economic blueprint for our country, climate change is a priority. But how gender responsive is Climate Act of 2016? So the first is Article 6, and it provides for gender and intergenerational responsive public education awareness strategy and an implementation plan. The second highlight is the National Climate Change Action Plan 2023-2027. It calls for a gender strategy along with its implementation, but those are missing. Of what makes it sad is the 2/3 gender principle, a constitutional right that a third of every gender must be represented in elective and appointive positions in our government. So it states clearly that the president shall appoint members and ensure compliance with the 2/3 gender rule. So today I can only call for strict adherence, especially in the ongoing vetting of the National Climate Change Council, and hopefully that they will at least consider a third. There is call for responsive public education and awareness strategy under Article 8. So the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister has to formulate the national gender and intergenerational response. That's to consider the youth. So since 2016, this has not taken place. I hope now is the time. Integration of climate change with gender studies, it's under Article 21. This has not happened. And colleagues, this is just a highlight of one act. The other acts are more severe. The other policies are more severe. So what are the interventions to make a Climate Change Act of 2016 more gender responsive? So it's clear that the act intends to safeguard everyone, including the vulnerable group. And as Julia Taylor has put it, Nadine, women are projected as what I will say weak rather than key actors in the climate change governance regime. Why can't we look at women as change agents, as knowledge transmitters of adaptation and mitigation of climate change? When women are portrayed as weak and listed among vulnerable groups, then they are viewed as a group that is in need of protection other than active participants in the administration of climate governance. I mentioned that there's the call for a third gender. There's another constitutional requirement of public participation. But when we say for women to participate in these discussions, there is a challenge because of technical terminology in the science of climate governance. So many Kenyan women find it difficult to interact with climate science. So let's move from the acts and the policies and the action plans. Let's focus on the gender responsive reporting. It was discussed yesterday in one of the breakout rooms, the NDCs of 2015. But allow me to go straight into the one that was released recently, 2023. under section 3. And I believe that we have negotiators seated in among us, including Emily. So she can say whether what I'm saying is true or not. So section 3 of the report requires the government to report on adaptation, loss, and damages. So the main goal is to bridge implementation gaps on productive sectors of the economy. And there's no highlight of women. A table, specifically page 38 and 41, have prioritized adaptation programs. Again, gender, youth, and vulnerable groups, including indigenous communities, are not highlighted. So what are the existing requirements? Develop a social safety net structures and consolidate successful technologies and ensure that there's development of skills transfer strategy. Again, women, gender, there's no mention at all. And it's sad that even the skills transfer strategy, where women had hope that some of the skills could be transferred to them, there's nothing there. So as I move towards the end of this presentation, what's the key finding? The policies do not take into account the differences between men and women, be it physical, emotional, and then the roles and the knowledge gaps. So the 4 focus areas, that is productivity and income increment, then we should focus on maximizing gender-specific advantages and natural talents. On strengthening adaptation, then we must promote resilience to variability and diversify working seasons so that women have time to do the care work and also to do the formal work. Reduce greenhouse gases. And women must be highlighted as key actors on gender equality, gender pay equity, composition of workforce, and leadership of the workforce. And then we have to create accomplished, adaptable, and self-reliant men and women. So what was I looking for in terms of the policy analysis? Access to resources, it means being able to profit and having control. I didn't say that. Gender parity, that is equal contribution and equal opportunities for both males and female. Then there's social inclusion. That is creating opportunities for specific groups of people like women. So when it's mentioned that women are not a homogeneous group, this is what is supposed to be there: the marital status, education levels, access to technology. So as I conclude, the overview of all these policies that I've mentioned, evidence-based, we talked about data yesterday. It's missing. So the policies are just made in the boardroom. There's gender bias, policy planning, poor policy planning, poor implementation. Should I say no implementation of that, but just to say that the government is trying, but they need to do more. The last one is minimal research on women and men roles, specific gender-based roles. So what I'm recommending is that there's need to enhance the capacity of both women and women, review the terms of employment and merge various acts and policies. So this is what I leave you with. We need to improve the policies and create inclusive and gender responsive measures, create equal opportunities for men and women, involve women and other marginalized people in policy development. And I must mention here that the backbone of climate governance lies in the inclusion of men, women, youth, persons with disabilities in the evidence-based policy making processes. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. That's really helpful. Thanks so much, showing really nicely how these policy gaps reinforce inequalities. And I think it is a really nice lead into, because you mentioned also not just women, but people with disabilities. And I think that's a really nice lead over to our next presenter. Willem Stassen. So I'm not sure if he is. Willem, are you with us in the room or online?
I'm online today.
Hi, Willem. Very nice meeting you. So Willem Stassen is a senior lecturer at the Division of Emergency Medicine. And we are really excited to have you here and providing us some insights when we think about people with disability and extreme events. So Willem, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to tell you about a project that we are planning, not a project that we have already completed. And hopefully you'll be able to give us some of your thoughts on this project. So just to start, I want you to imagine just for a moment that you're sitting in an informal dwelling, that it's winter in Cape Town and you are reliant on a wheelchair for mobility because of paraplegia, because you had an accident a couple of years ago. And suddenly you're yelling and screaming outside, and you can hear a rush of water filling into your room, and your wheelchair gets sort of washed away in that process. The water is freezing as it starts rising up in your informal dwelling, and you are stuck. You cannot move. This is a stark reality for many people as it relates to the most vulnerable in our communities. They face extreme weather events, and currently the disaster risk reduction processes are not actually inclusive of people with disabilities. So our project then, yes.
We hate to interrupt you, but we can't see your slide if you're sharing anything. Is that fine? Okay, I just wanted to give him the chance in case you wanted to show something that we're not seeing. If you don't want to.
I am sharing it on. I am sharing it on Zoom. I am sharing it on Zoom.
Yeah, so we see. I just wanted to tell you that we're seeing a white square. We can hear you perfectly if you want to go ahead, but if you wanted to show us something, I just wanted to let you know.
Yes, I'm showing you a white screen, a white square actually.
Yes, a white square, and if you can switch maybe your camera on, if that's a possibility.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
One moment.
All right, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No stress. Let me just quickly go out of all of my screens. You should be able to see me now.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Willem.
Perfect. Okay. So that was a story that was supposed to really grip you with the fear that someone might be experiencing when there's a flood going through their house. And what I try to convey is a sense of vulnerability, and our programs are not really focusing on giving these people a voice. So what we're really trying to do in our project is to develop an approach to community-based, disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction systems. And the project aims to reduce the vulnerability and bolster the resilience within these communities that might have a high risk to climate-related disasters. And we're hoping to focus on those who are most exposed. And I think what we need to acknowledge is that people with disabilities do actually represent an intersecting vulnerability, as they are some of the most marginalized and excluded. But they also have other roles in the community related to their gender, maybe related to poverty, because disability is both a cause and a consequence of poverty in many ways. So we therefore work from the premise that placing these extremely vulnerable individuals at the center of our project, we will develop a systems approach that cater for the most excluded, using a lens of leaving no one behind. So 15%, that's approximately how many people across the world have some kind of an impairment. And these numbers are growing due to aging, due to increased chronic illnesses, wars and conflict, forced migration, climate change, natural disasters, and increasing poverties and inequalities across different places as it relates to climate and climate disasters. We know that 80% of the world population live in amongst the poorest countries. And again, illustrating this, sort of intersecting and rather than intersecting, compounding vulnerability that people might be experiencing. Over the last 20 years, 3.9 billion people have been affected by disasters. And we can argue that 15% of those are then people with some kind of an impairment and a disability. We also see that the amount of disasters are increasing year on year, and we are certainly expecting that they will be increasing a lot more in the coming decades, as you all know, sitting in the room there. So what are we suggesting? We are a multidisciplinary group of researchers at UCT and industry. We are emergency medicine that are involved in disaster and emergency responses and looking at access to emergency care. We have colleagues from disability studies who seek to help us with the disability inclusive development approach. We have people or researchers from social anthropology, helping us to understand the ethnographic and social context of individuals as it relates to disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. We are involved with a nonprofit company called Disaster Management Solutions, and they are looking at disaster risk assessments and the scalability of the project that we're dealing with. We are also working with electrical engineering because, of course, the early warning systems are not necessarily accessible to people with certain impairments like visual impairment or hearing impairment. And too often we want to leverage off of technology to say that this is sort of our idea of ensuring that there is early warning systems and that people can respond to potential climate disasters. But we do not think always that these are, or we do not think at the element of accessibility for people with certain impairments. And then we're working with ACDI also, where we will focus on the climate adaptation and mitigation elements of our project. So what we're trying to do here is to really leverage off of the different disciplines that we are working with, and to find intersectionality where we can really focus on developing this program to ensure that no one is left behind, actually. And we've had our first workshop, which was really interesting, how when we talk about the term resilience, some of our colleagues had a really visceral reaction to the idea of resilience as it relates to social justice, arguing that that resilience is always the marginalized community that's expected to be resilient, but we don't actually do anything to uplift and to really focus on ensuring that we have inclusivity in the systems that we're developing. Whereas in the climate world, resilience is really in many ways the goal that we are striving towards. So what are we going to do? We are planning a sort of a 4-phase approach where we will be focusing again through the lens of nothing about us without us in a very participatory approach. So first, through our stakeholder workshops, we seek to identify a partner community where we will be doing the work, and also, which we have done actually already, and we're focusing on conceptual alignment between the different disciplines. Through an ethnographic and qualitative descriptive study, we seek to understand the current reality as it relates to disaster risk mitigation, resources, community perceptions, and complex social structures in the identified community, so that we can get an understanding of what are some of the complexities related to the social constructions within those communities around disaster, around risk reduction, and around disability inclusivity. We also seek to then understand and map out the existing disability inclusive disaster risk reduction systems that are in place, if there are any, and there probably won't be. We then seek to explore community-based disaster risk reduction systems and strategies. We seek to explore the level of engagement with and inclusion of the needs of people with disabilities in the disaster preparedness processes. And we seek to identify and document the key barriers encountered by people with disabilities in accessing community-based disaster risk reduction efforts, and also access to care in the situation where a disaster might occur. And our overall objective of this project, which will run for the rest of the year, is to contribute to knowledge, tools, and advocacy processes to push disability inclusive disaster risk reduction processes across the board. And I have to say, it has been a very enlightening process for me. I've not worked with disability studies before, but it is essential for us to say, if we are going to be reducing vulnerability, and if we are going to be reducing inequality, we have to focus on people with disabilities, so that we can ensure that our processes are actually truly equitable, are actually truly inclusive, because this is one of the only ways that we can actually develop not only climate justice, but justice in its conception of access to emergency care, which is my field, and ensuring that no one is actually truly left behind. Thank you.
Really great presentation. I actually have a question for you, and this is the partner community. How do you select it? Was it geographically, or because that might be quite tricky? So maybe just a few.
Yes. So the partner community we selected based on a couple of different things. So the first thing is it's a pilot project. So we're working on proof of concept here rather than on impact itself for the moment. But the partner community we selected based on climate vulnerability, based on having a community that is a disabled community that we are able to access and work with. So we needed to have a sort of a strong focus on having partners within that community. We worked with the City of Cape Town Disaster Management Centre in order to find areas where they already have existing projects that we can tap into. And then we also had to focus on two other aspects related to safety for the researchers. So, of course, because there's an ethnographic element of this, there's a lot of on-the-ground work that we needed to, or that needs to happen. So that was one of the factors also that we looked at. And then we had to look at ensuring that the community that we're selecting is actually a community that is acknowledged by the City of Cape Town to be not invading land, but rather a community that is sort of legitimized in that way, where the city wants to actually or will invest in infrastructure in the end. So that was sort of how we ended up selecting the community.
Very much for explaining, and a really exciting project, very important. I really like the interdisciplinary approach and bringing in the stakeholders right from the beginning. And with that, I think I would like to introduce our last speaker, Prince Asana. Prince is joining us online. I'm just checking if Prince is here. Prince, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So Prince is actually a researcher at my institute, the African Climate and Development Initiative. He recently completed his PhDs, and today's presentation will actually show some insights into intersectionality based on the research he has done in Northern Ghana. Prince, over to you.
Okay. Should I share my presentation, or Hajira share from your end?
I think you can go ahead and share your presentation. No, sorry, you cannot.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. As we wait for the presentation to be shared, I'm very much excited to be with you today. It's unfortunate I couldn't be with you in person. I was looking forward to that. So I'll be talking more on how food production can be met amidst of all the socioeconomic and biophysical challenges that we face in our world today, including population growth, economic growth, which actually facilitates higher demand for food, and also with the climate change, issues around water access, drought, climatic risk, and how all these socio and biophysical challenges are going to pose complex challenges to food production in general. Is the presentation on?
No, not yet, Prince.
Not yet. Okay, all right.
You're just waiting, and then I might have to just take you through the slides. So you just have to guide me when to switch it. Sorry,
Okay.
we're just setting it up. Would it be possible for Prince to share in Zoom? Maybe Prince, can I just, our technical experts, should he share it? Okay, so while we're waiting for setup, I was just wondering if anybody so far has any questions. So. Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
Finally.
I will come back to you. I think it's right. Okay, Prince. So just let me know when I need to change the slides.
Yes, to the next slide. Okay, so there's a first slide before this one. Thank you. So today I'll be taking you straight to West Africa, especially in the semi-arid areas of northern Ghana, and try to let us understand how the implications of social differentiation could have on sustainable intensification, which is a very, should I say, modern conversation on how food production could be achieved overall, especially in vulnerable community or vulnerable environments. Yes, next slide. So this is going to be my outline. I'll basically introduce what sustainable intensification and what it is, and the problem of my particular research. And this research is part of a broader research from my PhD. The objectives will be discussed, the conceptual framing that was used for this particular study, discuss a bit of the methodology, and then the key findings, recommendations, and conclusion would also be treated here, plus the references next. So, basically, food demand is expected to actually increase, especially with the growing population and also with economic development. So with economic development comes with more people being empowered to be able to have, or let me put it this way, purchasing power also increases as economic development also increases. And at the same time, with all these social, should I say, benefit or challenges, comes also with biophysical constraint, especially with climate change and climatic risk, and also with issues around poor soils, which in general are going to challenge food production systems across the globe, and especially in vulnerable areas. Typically in Ghana, food production sector has actually struggled to meet food production targets, especially the crop sector has failed to meet the production targets outlined in various national agriculture policy, especially for semi-arid northern areas. To be able to actually make sure that food production actually meets the demand, and also farmers produce enough amidst of climate change and all the biophysical and socioeconomic challenges. There's been a lot of debate on how this could be done. So we've heard about different things, climate smart agriculture, we've heard about agroforestry, we've heard of conservation agriculture, and so many more. And especially in West Africa, and typically in Ghana, most farmers or most smallholder farmers or producers attempt to increase crop production by expanding more land or by intensifying land. So, and the more land which is cleared to produce crop production, it also actually set back the efforts on mitigation, and at the same time also some of the key practices or some of the main practices that are used on the land also affect the soils, and also at the end of the day reduce yields in general. So one of the key solutions that have been proposed by the IPCC and many other experts is by using what we call the sustainable intensification of agriculture system. Now, sustainable intensification of agriculture system, as widely defined by many scholars, especially by Garnett, is that it's a form of production system where yields are increased, or farmers attempt to increase yields without adversely impacting, having an adverse impact on the environment or the biophysical characteristics, and also making sure that you are not cultivating more land. So as we increase, especially in West Africa, as I mentioned earlier on, where extensification is the order of the day, sustainable intensification comes at a time where farmers would be able to balance not increasing farmlands, but at the same time increasing yields and having less impact on the environment. Next slide. So the problem in general, especially in northern Ghana, is that there's a limited knowledge exists, especially in literature, on sustainable intensification in general. How would sustainable intensification play out in northern Ghana or in semi-arid northern Ghana, and how these outcomes from sustainable intensification could achieve equity and benefit all social groups. So sustainable intensification in previous work, which were done in developing countries, were done in a way that it did not take into consideration how equitable could the farming system be for all social groups, regardless of gender, age, education, the type of community you are coming from, marital status, and the like. However, in northern Ghana especially, cultural norms and traditions have limited the right of some social groups to access agricultural resources that could enhance productivity and enable them to achieve sustainable intensification goals. Next slide. So the objectives of this research was to assess, first of all, assess the household characteristics or farmer characteristics that could determine crop productivity and livelihood outcomes in semi-arid northern Ghana, and further on understand how household characteristics could enable or hinder implementation of sustainable intensification among smallholder production systems in northern Ghana. So not just to understand the characteristics, but how are these characteristics, what are the implications of these characteristics on sustainable intensification, especially relating to equitable distribution. So this is the conceptual framework that was used for the entire study in general, especially for sustainable intensification. And broadly, these are there are four main pillars, which are the biophysical, social, economic, and institutional, which are the pillars that actually define the indicators and the drivers that actually determines how farming system could be determined as a sustainable one or sustainable intensification one or not. And then the goals that we look forward to achieve, especially in sustainable intensification, is productivity, resilience, efficiency, and equity. Now, in previous work and previous studies, especially in West Africa, most of them, or most of the work limit them to these three goals, which is productivity, resilience, and efficiency. And equity was not discussed as a major component of sustainable intensification. But as we go into the slides, we get to understand why equity is important to be included in sustainable intensification, and not just sustainable intensification, but any form of farming system that actually seeks to promote food production and food security on a larger scale. Next. So the methodology that was used was a mixed methods, and both quantitative and qualitative. The quantitative side, we surveyed over 400 households from 6 communities in 2 regions in northern Ghana, which is the Upper East and Upper West. Various types of data were collected especially on household characteristics from education, marital status, age, occupation, and the likes. Also, some of the data that was collected included the practices, on-farm practices, and access to agricultural resources, data on yield produced, yield consumed, yield sold, data on expenditure, incomes, loans, data on off-farm activity, migration, maternity, livelihood. Now, this data were collected with particular goal of understanding how various social groups within the agricultural system either have access to some of these agricultural resources, or how they consume food, how they sell some of their produce, how much they even spend on their farms. And this could actually tell us more about how various social groups would play, the roles various social groups would play in terms of sustainable intensification, whether they'll be able to achieve it or not. The qualitative methods, we went into in-depth interviews, about 12 of them. Especially the in-depth interviews were done mostly after the survey, so that we could go deep into some of the emerging issues that came. We did 6 focus group discussion with over 100 participants and 10 key informant interviews, which all merged together nicely to be able to give us the type of results that were useful for this study. Now, the key findings. So the next slide. So for the key findings, I outlined 6 of them here. Now, what we found out, which may not be surprising at all, especially in West Africa, is that male-headed households tend to have higher productivity than female-headed households, basically due to unequal access to agricultural resources like cropland, input, and services. And also, they tend to also have higher adoption. Female-headed households tend to have lower adoption of efficient strategies. Now, specifically, I want to talk about the access to cropland, or access to land. In a part of the world, especially in northern Ghana, most women are not allowed to own land. So even though you can access land, but you are not allowed to own it. So, and because they are not allowed to own it, it means that land tenure security is a big issue. So female farmers or women are usually not motivated or incentivized to invest into cropland, meaning that there's going to be a reduced crop productivity on their side. And with this, it means that in sustainable intensification parameters, what it means is that their productivity is going to be low, their resilience will be low, and their efficiency will be low because they are unable to own land themselves and also being able to invest in it. The second one is that married household heads are mostly men, are more likely than unmarried ones to have access to extensive cropland.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, you have 2 minutes left. So
all right, I'll just run through quick. All right, so they tend to cultivate more crops for consumption than market, especially the married ones. Now, the third one is that household heads with formal education. So we realize that formal education is very important, which enable farmers who are highly educated or who have some high form of formal education to be able to access improved seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, information and the likes, which helps them to be able to increase yields and being resilient in all that respect. The fourth one is the less educated older women who reside in communities without permanent water sources for irrigation were also identified as the most vulnerable social groups. So this group of people are the ones that attention also needs to be on. The fifth one is that those with higher education, as I mentioned, especially the young men in communities with irrigation, are the ones that are considered to be more resilient. However, that's point 6, both the most vulnerable and the most resilient farmers can actually cause a lot of impact on the environment because all of them are trying to increase productivity based on what key outcome they are looking for. Next slide. So the recommendation, what it means is that SI practice require a constant negotiation between social structures, especially between vulnerable and resilient groups who are recognizing the vulnerabilities and power dynamics within the agriculture system. Implementing efficient resource distribution must accompany policies that achieve equity among social groups within the agriculture system. The last slide. Yes, so in conclusion, addressing the current and future food security problems in semi-arid areas in Africa or West Africa through sustainable production system like SI, which is sustainable intensification, may probably not be possible if agricultural resources like land, inputs, services are not fairly distributed across all social groups. Strong social policy and practical negotiations, as I mentioned earlier on, are needed at the local level, locally, to empower all social groups to participate fully in SI interventions to create a win-win crop productivity and also for sustainability of the environment. So yes, so thank you. That's the final slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prince. Sorry for keeping you a bit short, and it's a technical hiccup. Can I please ask our 2 speakers that are present and our 2 discussants, Abena and Jacqueline, to please come up, and our 2 discussants to please provide their reflections to us. So our first discussant is Abena Oduro. She lectures at the Department of Economics at the University of Ghana, and she's actually the outgoing president and conference chair of the International Association for Feminist Economics. Welcome, Abena.
And thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be the discussant for this session. We have had interesting papers, and listening to the presentations, the theme running right across the different presentations is that of intersectionality, which means, although I'm sorry, I'm not going to get into it, that we need to give some thought as to what intersectionality means. But listening to the discussions, basically what is coming up is that there is heterogeneity among women and there's heterogeneity among men. And indeed, if we're talking about gender relations, many a time we seem to focus on women, but with intersectionality, recognizing the heterogeneity that can also exist amongst men, it is important that we look across the different groups. And indeed, the presentation, I think, by Prince brought it up, and that is if I understood his, I think it was the second or third finding about married men, where he mentioned that married men, I think, have higher, households headed by married men have higher productivity than do, am I right, in unmarried men. And I found that a very interesting point, in terms of when we think about, because intersectionality is also raising the issues of different oppressions and different disadvantages that groups face. We then find that within the context of men, there is some disadvantage amongst, seems marital status is important, and age in differentiating amongst the men. So this is an important thing that we need to take into account as we are discussing gender analysis. Now, when it comes to Julia's paper on the just energy transition, again, there was an interesting point that was made, and I wasn't clear if I understood it well enough, that the woman as homemaker and the man as breadwinner, division of labor in the household. And I was asking myself, that woman as homemaker, is she working? We don't have information about that, or are we just focusing on the roles within the household? Because you may find that much as we talk about a breadwinner model, especially within the African context, or at least especially within the context that I am coming from, invariably the woman is working, even though we talk about a breadwinner model. So what exactly do we mean about when we talk about the man as the breadwinner? Because the woman is, in some instances, is not just contributing because of what she does within the home, but is actually involved in the market economy. Is that still the breadwinner model? And then my observation for Jacqueline's paper, looking at the policy gaps and all the provisions, you highlight some provisions in a particular act. I wasn't able to note down what the act was. It's reflective of the situation in many African countries, where it's almost as if we tick the box, because especially the donors require that we need to be to take into account gender. We are there ticking the box when it comes to putting in place policies or acts, etc. And I was left thinking in the presentation, I don't know whether it's something that you address, why have the provisions not been implemented? Is it something that you could speak about? Why these provisions have not been implemented? And then finally, again, coming back to the paper of Prince, but it also runs through the other papers, is the issue of norms. The issue of, should I say, gendered social and cultural norms. And as we are thinking about policy recommendations, I think we need to give some thought. What can be done to change these norms? Because sometimes that is what is driving everything. That is what is driving resistance and the perpetuation of some of the gender inequalities that we observe. Thank you.
Thanks, Abena. Really nice reflections. And with that, I would like to hand over to Jacqueline Mosomi. She is a researcher here at University of Cape Town with Ansah.
Thank you, Nadine. I'm happy to be here. So I do not want to repeat what has already been said. Maybe first tackle the issue of how can we leverage the climate change adaptation and mitigation conversation to reduce the already pre-existing gender inequalities. So we've spoken a lot about the place of women in the labor market, the place of women in the household, the place of women in terms of ownership and gender roles. How can we use this discussion to bring in the men to the table, and so that it's not always men versus women, because progress cannot happen if we are not together at the table and in the same room. So before, okay, maybe in the past, whenever we wanted to address the issue of gender inequality, it always seemed to be, you know, that discussion about women. But maybe climate change adaptation and mitigation, which is something we cannot avoid, is something that is gender neutral. So it's neither male or female, it's affecting both. So probably, so the presentations covered, you know, the just transition, issues about land ownership. So possibly this is the time to discuss how, you know, giving women land ownership rights then benefits everyone. So it reminds me of a story from an Asian country. So where seedlings were to be provided for, you know, for trees. And so the decision was about, are we going to plant hardwood or softwood? So then the hardwood seedlings were provided and those trees were not taken care of and they died. Why? Because the men received the seedlings and the women do the planting and the taking care of the planting. And since the women were not interested in the hardwood, because men are interested in the hardwood because then they are furniture makers and they sell the furniture and make money. And women are interested in wood that is going to be helpful in the household. So then they let the hardwood trees die. So in that analogy is, can we bring, you know, both sides to the room, and then maybe the policies that we want to, you know, enact, then they can be taken up. So it reminds me of Julia's presentation when she talked about, you know, the solar panels and how that community in the Northern Cape was not interested. They thought that was not useful to them. So maybe it's because there was no information sharing. So the people, you know, on the ground were not brought to the table. To finish, so in the just transition literature, since we can't avoid it, and the discussion on green jobs, the findings are that these jobs require, you know, on average, higher skills. They're mostly occupied by people in, you know, professional positions. Then how do we think about how this then will reproduce inequalities in the future? Who will get to the opportunity for upskilling? How do we think about the people who are in jobs that are not considered decent, which are preserved or mostly, you know, are done by women, are jobs in like waste recycling and such jobs. So I guess instead of just the doom and gloom is how do we leverage this discussion to reduce the already existing gender inequalities? Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I think what was really nice to see that all four presentation really trying to delve into this complexity that we see on the ground and trying to really understand better these power relation and how to address them. Also seeing the different scales, whether it's policy, whether it's specific place-based interventions that are taking place. So it's really exciting to see that we are moving away from this binary thinking and just focusing on gender, whereas there are many more other structural challenges that we really seriously need to address. But I know we are over our time already, but I'm sure there are a couple of questions that the audience might have. So can be Britta, please. Oh. Okay, so I know there was one question right in the beginning, so maybe we could start off there.
So thanks so much for such beautiful presentations. I have two short questions. Sorry, I've forgotten your name, the one that presented on the gender just energy transition. I was expecting that towards the end, as you finalize and you are saying the transition, the energy transition is not gender engendered, so to say, you'd also give us recommendations on how we would want to go about it if we wanted to ensure that the energy transitions are engendered, so to say. I think I'm looking at this because I think the energy sector is extremely unequal. Inherently unequal, and therefore we should be looking at what could we do radically, so to say, in order to ensure that it is actually engendered. My other reflection was on our colleague that presented on the disability, I think online. I was wondering what is the interplay of disability and gender in the proposed work, because I think that is another intersectionality that we also need to be looking at. But I think he didn't go further to explore that that possibility in their work.
While we are passing on the microphone, do you want to answer?
Yeah. Thanks very much. So in terms of recommendations, it's hard to recommend something when it's a complex problem, but I would say that a lot of the time I ask people what do they think would be more useful to them, instead of like a big solar power plant that hasn't affected them. And they mentioned, smaller scale things. They need like a solar torch, they need a solar geyser, maybe microgrids would be a better option. And so there's a question about whether smaller scale interventions might be more accessible and just potentially, but it also depends on how those things are rolled out and in what context and who owns them and all of those questions. But I think the temptation is to say, well, we should just have like training programs for women in renewable energy. And that could be a good project, but it's certainly not necessarily going to address these issues around social reproduction, unpaid care work in the home, and this broader crisis of social reproduction, which I pointed to in the presentation. And just to comment on the question about the woman as homemaker versus men as breadwinner roles, I certainly question whether that's definitely not an assumption of kind of how society is, but I wanted to ask people what roles they do adopt in the home, and it does seem that these stereotypes are still pervasive. So even though there is heterogeneity in terms of what people do, women are productive, they are, farming, they are working, they are also doing care work in the home. But it did seem that when I asked who looks after the children and who does the cleaning and cooking, it was most often a woman in the household or even a child. So that was the reason for that statement, not that that's what exists in, and it's in a clear-cut or binary way. Thanks.
Willem, are you still with us?
Willem?
As we wait for William, I had a question from Abena on the specific act that I sampled, and it's called the Climate Change Act of 2016. And the reason why there is no implementation, I mentioned it in my presentation. One, that there is no political goodwill. And my background is political science and public administration. That's my department at the university. So one is outright, there is no political goodwill. Yesterday, we had a representative from the Presidential Climate Change Commission of South Africa. In that commission, 13 members are female, and that's a fair representation, 50-50, I would say, compared to our National Climate Change Council, which is 13% only, a third. But we've had challenges with access to resources for women in terms of what are women doing then. There's no political goodwill from government. So what are the men and women on ground? So the question of access to resource, the question of social inclusion, do we have enablers like decent work, dignified living? And then I talked about building the capacity of men and women at especially the youth and academic system, so that as we are bringing up kids, as we are socializing them, then they're able to relate with inclusion of both men and women, and as well as persons with disability and other minority groups. But however, allow me to mention Wangari Maathai. It's a global icon, and she was fighting for environment, and she was a lady and she did well. So it means that if we have both women and men leaders, then we'll do better, other than having one gender and excluding the other one.
Thanks, Jacqueline. All right, Willem, are you still here? And otherwise, I think let's send over to the next set of questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Mine is just for all of them to think about it. There's a transitional generational change that is happening. So the gender inequalities you're having right now may not be in the next 10 years. So the research you're giving or the research you're doing, has it catered for that change? Because our parents loved land. They would do anything to make sure the men owned land. Today, the generation is give me cryptocurrency, give me something else. It is not that, it's not the same. The things you're calling inequalities, maybe in the next 10 years may not be inequalities. So have you catered for that? The second bit is the aspect of technology. During COVID, this enhanced the change of the traditional way of doing things as a society. So if those gender roles that you have described, that it's more of the women, they can buy a machine washer and someone will do those roles. So then what next? You know, so where does technology, where are you considering that generational transition that is happening within our space right now? And lastly, we're talking about climate change. Has really climate change brought in the gender inequalities, or the gender inequalities were there long before climate change happened? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Really good reflections to take forward. I think due to time, can we maybe have one more person who, yeah. Okay, but Prince, can we take one more question here in the audience? And I think, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I just comment on what my colleague has just said. We know that society is always in transition. What was there last year or 5 years ago is not what is there. If we look at the hunters and gatherers of those days, then the industrial period, and then the modern man, we are always moving and things are always changing. So even the gender roles are actually changing with time. what was there 5 years ago in some community and not what is done now. Because you find there's infiltration from the outside. New ideas are coming in. So the society is always picking what can work for them, and they're leaving behind what may not work for them. For instance, what my children are doing now, the roles they are doing are not what I'm doing as a mother, because I belong to the other generation. So as my colleague is saying, as we move on, that gender gap will become smaller and smaller, and at some point it will twist. I did a study in a community where the women are actually taking up the men's role in the adaptation process. So we should look at that as we move on. Thank you.
So it really shows the dynamic nature. Britta? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions, if I can just highlight them, or small comments, maybe especially to Julia's presentation. So I was very intrigued by that presentation, and there seemed to be quite a lack of awareness of what these solar power plants actually do and how they fit into the electricity sector, right? So what you've just offered as alternatives as home appliance, obviously much closer to the household and would have very different impacts on, you know, gender and livelihoods than a large scale farm that's utility scale that actually feeds into energy security. So I wonder if people were actually at the level to understand what it does in terms of national security and what it adds into actually reducing load shedding, the more capacity that you have. Secondly, I wonder, there's that program that's kept changing for community development, right? So the community development criteria that are built into the renewable energy program. And there's been quite a lot of work on stakeholders engagements to see how actually the companies pay into community trusts, and they then get governed by a couple of stakeholders in those communities for projects that are self-determined. So they build schools and things that are to the benefit of the community. There was something unique to this program, and it didn't come up in your presentation at all. So I just wondered if that could have been by the nature of the way that interviews were selected, or where that would have been. And then the last point really is around there's a lot of work on the impacts of public works and you know what it does in terms of livelihoods in surrounding communities. And obviously this would also be public works, but I wonder how it's different from other public works. So it could be roadworks, railroads, it could be a power, other kind of energy technology been put in close by. So what is it that makes it different for solar, which is relatively clean compared to any of the fossil fuel alternatives? You know, if you put those into communities where you come with coal and acid mine drainage and all sort of issues surrounding, if that came up as an issue. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks very much for the questions. I don't know if I caught the last one, but I'll try my best with the first two. So yes, I think that's it's a great observation. I think people seeing a power plant in the distance, and I think not fully, I guess the fact that their own electricity access hasn't improved, and the prices of electricity are still increasing nationally is kind of representative that they don't experience the benefit from that solar power plant, which is supposed to be cheaper, and but yeah, whether that's the fault of the solar power plant is a question. So, and then in terms of the social development initiatives, there were social development initiatives from various of the power plants. I interviewed a couple of them and investigated some of these. Most of the interventions were around teaching. So they had invested in local schools and supported teacher training programs and, done a few bursaries. And again, it could have been a result of kind of who I was interviewing. But the communities that I interviewed, kind of said, yeah, they had a launch, we attended a launch and we got a free lunch, but like that was, that's kind of their memory and like grasp of what has been happening. And they were kind of saying, well, why don't they give us, electricity? Surely they're like a solar power plant. So I think the social development spend is questioned, like, why is it going to that? Why isn't it coming to, energy access? I think was an issue. And yeah, thanks.
Your thoughts are that.
And my name's Pete. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name's Peter Wolpe. I'm working independently in this space. So I just very quickly, because I know there's tea. I find it quite depressing what I've heard, actually, particularly, I suppose I'm really interested in the gender. Abena, you said at the end, how do we change these norms? And I really do think if the issues around gender and feminism have been on the table for many years. I mean, I'm not young, so I know that. And I'm very disturbed that a lot of the questions are very much the same. I think what we haven't talked a lot about is energy poverty in the yesterday. I don't think it'll come up very strongly today, although it's been touched upon. And I think there's a gap in research around gender and energy poverty. And I just want to support what you said, Julia. I think there's been quite a lot of studies done on the socioeconomic development side. So it's not just your sample. Whilst the intention has been really good, I don't think it's been hugely successful. And I think you said something about Jacqueline, is it Jacqueline? Yeah, about the political will and the kind of political economy. And I think we have to start really going in there. I think Salim Fakir touched on it at the end of the day yesterday, and I feel that's a gap, because I think that keeps us quite stuck in the situation. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, one final one, and I think then we really have to close the session.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was provoked a little bit by Njambi when she mentioned my name while making her presentation. And I'm very much in line with the statement that was made by our second panelist, that really work on climate change. It started when we were really gender blind. Most of the people that were engaged even in the development of the Framework Convention itself were from the Met department. So it was rather a dull sort of area. But the provisions for all gender were actually sort of made. It's just that they were not lifted out. And when this move came in on issues of gender, for some time it was like a little disruption, but that has been taken on board. Now, in the case of the Kenyan area work on climate change, it's amazing because it's really been led by women. And again, I would say the women must have been gender blind and say in the provision of the Act on issues that she says have not really been lifted out and elaborated. I think it was left that, say, the Commission on Gender, which is already in place, would actually lift those and run with them. It would not be just the Department of Climate Change to come out with all these issues. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jacqueline, do you want to respond? And
Thank you. I'll start by responding to my two senior colleagues on transitional generational change, which I mentioned in the presentation, that it's not only focused on women, and there's a question of young person. So I spoke about creating equal opportunities for all, so that in 2023, in 3033, in 2123, the technology will not be biased. So there's skills transfer for both men and women. And then the question of education systems, integrating climate change, integrating gender studies, so that we have people, a generation after us, and that the policies do not accelerate or advance gender-based inequalities. So in response to Brett, we have strong social policies. We need to have practical negotiation, and the policy making processes has to be based on evidence. I think that was emphasized yesterday. To the last question, how do we deal with the political economy? It's very clear in the SDGs. Let us have shared prosperity where we both contribute, all of us, we contribute, and all of us benefit, so that no one is left behind. In terms of gender blind and gender neutral climate change policies, now there is a new wake, and we have to be sensitive to all the needs of the people. And it's no longer climate change policies don't have to be made by the Minister of Environment and Forest and Fisheries. It's a question of all of us. So even the National Gender and Equality Commission in Kenya, it's good to bring the policy experts into it. It's good to have the lawyers. It's good to have the CSO. So in conclusion, I'm saying that this policy making cycle have to be, as we are seated here, inclusive of everybody from all sectors, so that we can attain the just transition that we are all dreaming for. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jacqueline. So with this, I think we really have to end now our session. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating, for our great speakers. And I just have an announcement. So the session 8 is in lecture hall 7, which is downstairs. Oh, okay. So there's several students assistants here, so that will help you to find the room. And because we are quite behind time, it would be really good if you have a coffee to go and slowly move into the different rooms if you are